So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey everybody. Glad you're here. Tracy Baim, thanks for joining me on Media Curious.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So this is episode 2. I'm excited to be starting this. It's all about talking to journalists and learning more about them and more about what goes on in their newsrooms and what they think's going on with media in the 21st century. So how's your week been?
You know, this year is really, in my 36 years of covering community, there's not very many comparables given the impact of the general news industry was already in a free fall, and then we have COVID hit, and then the response to the murder of another African American, this time in Minneapolis. So, you know, our teams are doing what they can to cover what they can, and what's great is there's so many great journalists that we can amplify. When we can't get to something, I can promote what they're doing. So it's an unbelievable time to be a journalist, to make sure the stories are being told right.
You also were working on a fundraiser for all Chicago media, Save Chicago Media. So the deadline for that fundraiser just came up, and I understand you're going to be wearing a dress soon.
Yeah, and you know, it ended at midnight last night. It was 40 plus independent local media outlets. Certainly not all of the outlets in town, but 40 plus African American, Latinx, Asian, LGBTQ. And at certain levels of the campaign, I promised I would wear a dress for the first time since senior prom, and high heels, which I've never worn, things like that. We blew way past our targets.
Fantastic.
And in fact, we're keeping it open all weekend because of procrastinators out there. I just tweeted to the procrastinators of the world, they have till Sunday. So we just passed $97,000 in individual donations, more than 1,000 people, and then $60,000 is being matched by foundations. So that campaign is close to $160,000 for 40 plus outlets. I'm blown away. Like, I would have been happy with a third of that. And it's really just the start to show that, look what we can do when we come together.
That's fantastic. Thanks for putting that together. It was you that went ahead and brought these 40 some outlets together, right?
So last year, the Chicago Reader launched the Chicago Independent Media Alliance. So it is a project of the Reader. We got a grant to cover a wonderful project coordinator, Yasmin Dominguez. She's a young journalist who'd been interning at WTTW. She'd worked at City Bureau a little bit as on a training ground. So she coordinates it, and we have over 60 members actually of SEMA. It doesn't cost anything to join. You have to be independent local outlet. And we hope that there are over 100 of them out there. So we do hope to add more. And I think this campaign will show what can happen when we come together. We hope to come together on both the business side as well as when there are industry issues, and then also on editorial projects too.
I'm looking forward to seeing what else happens as you move forward. I was doing my homework on you, and you are currently the publisher of the Chicago Reader. And 2 years ago, when you were talking to Forbes, supposedly you said this is one of the greatest honors of your life. So I'm wondering, does that still hold true?
Yeah, and one of the greatest challenges. You know, the Reader had been losing $1 million a year under the auspices of the Sun-Times. It wasn't really the Sun-Times' fault. When you have a daily newspaper that needs you, it's, you know, the weekly gets neglected. And so the two owners that took it over have been very generous, and I've done everything I said I would do, but then COVID hit, so we've had to pivot immensely. And our goal was not to lay off any journalists or furlough them or cut their pay. And so far, we have not had to do that. We lost 90% of our advertising immediately. And this is just an amazing group of people that helped us do the pivot to do books, best of books, coloring books, puzzles, all sorts of things to try to replace that revenue. Long term, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but being at the Reader, as opposed to the paper I own, which is Windy City Times, has allowed me to have a bigger impact and bigger footprint and get more people to the table to help all local media, including Windy City Times. So I think I'm at the right place at the right time for me, and for my dreams of what local journalism can be. There's some things out of my control, but the things that are within my control, I am grateful to have those opportunities to be here right now.
Something too that you made happen was the Chicago Reader is now a nonprofit, and it was sold to the Reader Institute for Community Journalism. So when
So technically, we're in the application process.
Oh, okay.
So the owners are Leonard Goodman and Elsie Higginbottom are the majority owners of the Chicago Reader, and they still are supporting it as much as they can through the end of this year. Our application went into the IRS in January. So the Illinois Charity Reader Institute has filed and exists, but it doesn't operate yet. What'll happen is hopefully we will get our nonprofit status, and the reader then will be turned over for $1 to that nonprofit. So we have the paperwork in order, we got the stuff ready to go, but the time that the IRS will take to approve that is out of our hands. And the goal is, you know, obviously to get new kinds of revenue. We still want to be advertising, we still have advertising and things like that, but we know that we can't rely on any one single track of revenue anymore. We want to remain a free paper and print and online. So it just gives us another tool in our toolkit.
Will it be a 501c3 or will it be a L3C or a different form of nonprofit?
So right now it's an L3C, which is a mission-driven corporation. And unfortunately, that's not operational in all 50 states. It is in Illinois. And a lot of foundations don't see it still as 501c3. So the status we have applied for is 501c3, and the L3C will go away once that happens. And the reason I wanted to push for the nonprofit in part is because, you know, the two owners were very generous in saving the reader, but they didn't want to subsidize it forever. And I felt like, well, if it's going to close, don't let it close on their watch, because they have done what they don't deserve that in many ways. It's a weird thing to think of it that way, but they don't deserve to be the last owners of the reader that closed it. I think that if the community doesn't turn out and it eventually closes, it becomes a different psychological thing that happens. And it's up to us to see if there's enough there. I've been blown away by the support that the community has for the reader. I always obviously knew it was a legendary publication. It had its baggage on some things, but it did amazing journalism over the course of its life. And but when I took over and we did our first membership campaign right away, probably most people would have told us don't do it that quickly, but we did. And we raised $130,000 from about 2,500 donors. And some of them just literally mailed in $1 money order. And so they had to get an envelope, get a stamp, get a money order. And the effort they took to do that, and the percentage of their income was probably as great as someone who might have given $1,000. So it was really kind of a very emotional campaign for me as a new person, but also for the longtime employees, because there had never been a membership campaign. So they never got that kind of, here's $1 for your work, or here's $1,000 for your work. So it really impacted everybody across the board, the young, the older ones, et cetera. And that showed us there was a path. And so it's up to us to kind of, you know, chop down the trees to get to that path. And we're still doing that. We don't have the solution. The benefit we have on this timeline is that if we get the nonprofit status by the end of the year, next year's the 50th anniversary of the reader. So depending on the impact of COVID and all these other things, we have some great plans to really celebrate and raise a significant amount of money that can carry the reader over the next couple years.
Fantastic. The Reader Institute for Community Journalism, is it going to be more involved than just owning the reader, or will there be other initiatives involved in that nonprofit?
So the SEMA project has been a great experiment for us to see about, can we create projects that don't distract from the mission of the reader and in fact enhance the mission? So I think that's a perfect example. Another example might be if there are small media outlets that need a fiscal agent or some kind of partnership on something they do. So let's say it's grant writing or some accounting back end or other kinds of things. We can see the Reader Institute becoming a hub for back end shared work, kind of like what City Bureau, Southside Weekly, that little complex, that I don't mean to diminish that big complex on the South Side does, and complementary to other things that are going on in journalism. So we don't want to step on any toes. We want to complement what's going on out there and provide potential hub for resources. That could be on advertising sales. It could be on editorial collaborations. There's a whole lot of ways it could go. The main mission has to be to save the readers' community journalism, but we can't do that in a vacuum. We need other media entities in the ecosystem to do our job the best we can do.
And we both know that it is some of those outlets that actually feed into the more mainstream outlets and help do some of the groundwork ahead of time before they dig in. So it's not just, it is an ecosystem, as you said, and the what is considered smaller outlets do some of the breaking work.
Right, and what's interesting is that street is no longer one way. It used to be that the smaller outlets, academic institutions, et cetera, were the training ground to go, and your holy grail was the New York Times. But I just saw the other day people talking about how the New York Times can't be considered that anymore, that community media is a legitimate alternative, and many ways is you're more free to break the kind of stories that then the mainstream media can't ignore anymore. And
right.
race issues in America have been abysmally covered by mainstream media, and community media, especially those operated by and for people of color, they're the only ones doing that story, whether it's a good story or a bad story. The problem with mainstream media is not just parachuting in on the bad, they never parachuted on the good. So it's a two-way street of training as well as sources and the actual stories and the breaking stories. Flint, Michigan being a good example. The national media really wouldn't have known about that if it wasn't first covered on the ground.
Thank you. Have you ever been potentially lured away? Have you been courted by anybody outside of Chicago?
It's interesting. Never. I've never sought it out, and I almost, and this is, I'm forever grateful. My academic friends tell me I dodged a bullet. I did apply for a teaching job about 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, because it was before the reader stuff. I applied at Northwestern University at a specific position in LGBT media.
Huh.
And I got, I'm sorry, I have to say, I never had actually sought out a position before, so I had to build my resume. I'd been at the same place that I co-founded forever ago, build a resume, get reference letters, and that was kind of fun. But I went through the whole process. I was in the top 5 in the country, which was, amazing. I did not get the job. And during the process, my friends who were academics were trying to just be nice. But once I didn't get the job, they said, oh my God, it would have crushed you. You would have loved the students, but you would have never put up with the bullshit in the administration. And what was interesting, the day I found out I didn't get the job, not only did my cat die, but also I literally found out as I'm at the vet putting my cat down, they called me. But the same day, a bunch of the journalism professors had issued an apology to the female students for not stopping the harassment that had been going on there. And they only really issued that public statement because a story came out, right? A story came out, I think in the Tribune, talking about that harassment that happened years before. And so I thought, oh my God, I might have lasted a minute before I would have said, I cannot do this. I cannot cover up an administration. I'm here for the students. So all power to the people who can be academics, and who knows, someday I might do it, but I am grateful because what it did for me is give me a confidence to say, you know what, I didn't get it. And then literally, like, this all happened within a few weeks. Then the Chicago Reader had that really racist cover of J.B. Pritzker sitting on a lawn jockey representing African-American aldermen, and they had to fire their publisher. I called Edwin Eisendrath, the publisher of the Sun-Times, like that week, and I said, Edwin, I'll come in and run the Reader for 3 months, see if there's anything to save. And that's all I said. I didn't say I wanted the Reader. And then all of a sudden I went and met with him, and he said, Tracy, you can have it for $1. And I said, no, because if it's losing money, it will fold under me in a week. Like, I won't be able to even meet one payroll. So I did actually put together a business plan and said, the business plan said, my team will come in and run the Reader for 3 months, look under the hood, and if it's viable, we will take it over. But they didn't like that plan. They wanted an emergency takeover, and thank God I said no. I said no. It was best no in my life. Because then a few months later, they announced the new takeover, and then that was literally 24 hours from being full. The Reader, that deal, nobody knew this, but it was it was about to be canceled because those owners spent 3 months looking under the hood. And they're like, wait a minute, we cannot do this. We don't have the capacity to save this. So the union for the writers called me. This is a lot of insider. Is this okay?
No, I appreciate all the detail because I was wondering myself, how did somebody have the bright idea to get you to be the publisher for?
So there was this whole through line. So I didn't get the job. The racist cover happens. I tell Edwin I'm interested, and then it goes away. So this is, and then in the summer, midsummer, they announced these new owners were going to take it over, but they didn't take it over immediately. It took several weeks of investigation. So I get a call from the writers union, somebody from the writers union, and they said, Tracy, would you like to take over the Reader? And I said, I can't talk to you because I'm under a non-disclosure agreement with Edwin. Talk to Edwin and see if I can talk to you. I said, I was interested, but I have no money. And they said, well, there might be money. They just don't have someone to do the day-to-day. Okay, so my dad's having open heart surgery. They called me. I get on the phone and Edwin says, let me have you meet with the reps for Elsie Higginbottom and Lynn Goodman. And luckily, so these all things happen for a reason. Luckily, I had already had a business plan in the spring. So this was like late August of 2 years ago. And so I brought my business plan with me. And this was like 24 hours. And I met with Eileen Rhodes and Jessica Stites, and they were repping those two owners. So I didn't even meet the owners. And I said to them, look, I think there's a path, and this is my plan, but we need $2.5 million. And it'll get us through 2.5 years, and it will get us to the place where we can get out of the current situation and get to the clear. And the lawyer had advised the L3C model. I didn't know anything about it. We were thinking about making it nonprofit right away, but that lawyer convinced all of us that that was a better way and it wasn't the right way for the Reader. But, you know, it was a temporary fix. So anyway, I never even met the owners. And I think like it was like on the spot accepted.
Wow,
and,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, then there was a lot of rigmarole to do, but basically the Reader was within 24 hours of closing. The staff didn't even know it. There was always these threats that it was going to be closing from the Sun-Times, but they didn't know how real that was. It really was just about to shut down. And so then I went and they were still working out of the Sun-Times, of course. So for several weeks, the final details were being negotiated, and the takeover happened October 1st. So they had contacted me end of August. So it took about 4 weeks to finish all the paperwork and all the details. And then Elsie built out an office in Bronzeville. So that took another month. So they still had to work at the Sun-Times while they were not owned by them anymore. So there were definitely some very awkward times in there. And then I had to build trust with this team. And I know that wasn't easy for them, you know, thinking I was coming from this little ragtag Windy City Times. I'm sure there was not a lot of trust and faith in what I was doing. But I think this crisis right now, this COVID crisis, from day one, I said, my job right now is to protect your jobs, no matter what. And so we went to biweekly. We did all sorts of creative projects. And I think we all came together really strongly as a team as a result of that. And, you know, now I feel like we are really poised to take advantage of the 50th anniversary and do lots of other things. But the weirdness of how it all happened was lots of accidents of fate. And I'm sure I didn't occur to anybody. I had made I made the boldness, which women usually don't do, to call Edwin Eisendrath, who I knew from when he was alderman in the 80s. So I knew him. And weirdly, he had called me when he was looking to put together the deal to buy the Sun-Times, seeing if I knew some wealthy people. So we had recent contact. So it was all just totally accidents and stumbling that got us to the point we're at today.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that part. How's the staff feeling about you these days? Are there any glimpses of affection, or are they still a little bit suspicious of you?
I say this very lovingly. We are all an island of misfit toys, which I think most of community media is. And we don't have I am not directly over all the editorial people, very intentionally. Karen Hawkins and Sujay Kumar are co-editors in chief, and everybody reports to them. So as much as I know of, I mean, I have no idea if there's any love lost or anything between us, but I do know that our relationship with the union reps is strong. And we've kept our word on everything. Like I have said and done everything transparently, and we've had staff retreats where I show them the budgets. As transparent as possible in a private corporation we have been. And I do believe that all of the last 3 months, and also that I come from a social justice background, and of course many of the reader people are frontline on that in terms of caring and coverage and participation, that they know we are aligned very well on belief systems and passion for journalism and independent journalism, et cetera. So I think, you'd have to ask them, but I feel like we are very strong as a team, and it makes it hard when those hard decisions might have to happen in a few months. And that's why I'm trying to be very honest with them, that if we work together on this and we support each other, we will make it through.
Well, thanks for your work that you've done so far. I think there's so many people in the Chicago community that appreciate the reader, and it's a blessing that you were able to take it over and save the jobs and save a paper that's so near and dear to so many people's heart. So
I feel lucky every day that I'm doing the job. It's been very hard the last 3 months. I've been mostly the only one in the office every day because everybody's working from home. So there's a little bit of isolation and weirdness and some little resentment in some ways that I'm trying to work through, because I'm working from home right now, but I work in weekdays in the office. But I'm learning better to be a better boss, I think, in terms of what's right for the employees as opposed to what's just always been done. It's always been done this way. Well, is there a reason it can't be done another way? And the Windy City Times was virtual it's been virtual for 12 years. So for 10 years before I took over, I worked at home anyway. So, and I knew I was very productive at home. So I think taking a combination of all my past experience and applying it to this situation is important, because I am still getting to know a lot of them. And Windy City Times, when we went virtual, some of those employees have been with me 20 years. So the trust was already there. So we're going to have to figure out other ways to make sure the team stays a team. But I know that our goal is to continue the virtual office possibly for forever, but certainly for the near future.
I don't know that anybody is, you should go back a few minutes. I don't know that anybody's calling the Windy City Times a rinky-dink publication. I think when you're working and you're kind of in your own shell and doing your thing, you don't have any perspective about what, how it's being received. And it's been a stalwart. It's been a staple in the Chicago community for so long. And it's not just that the gay, LGBTQ is reading it, but so are non-gays. And I think it's an important publication in our city.
And I think in the last 10 years, it's been treated with more respect than it was. And I have to say, I remember you inviting me to talk at AWJ, Association for Women Journalists, more than a decade ago, about the alternative is the new mainstream.
I was going to bring that up later. Yeah, I remember that too. And I'm like, and here it is,
And you doing that was a really important thing for me to see the respect from the mainstream, right? Like that was a pivot point, and I think in my feeling acknowledged in a mainstream press compared to LGBT press, right? And as a woman in LGBT press, believe me, a lot of sexism, getting called the C word, all sorts of things. So it's not like I felt like this love fest from my own LGBTQ community, but it was acknowledged in it, right? I had gotten awards from my own community, et cetera. But when AWJ invited me to speak, I don't know, that had to be early 2000s, maybe 2004 or 5. Yeah. And when I got the Studs Terkel Award in 2005 for Community Media Workshop, those two things really felt, oh, I guess people were paying attention. But it's also one of those things, you stay in one place long enough, you hope anyway, that you start to get seen. And I know that one of the issues I've always had for my late mother in her career is that she never stayed in one place long enough. She had to move around, not out of choice, but because she couldn't stay at the Tribune in the late 60s when they didn't want women covering hard news, or all sorts of other places she had to move and flit in and out of. So she never got the kind of recognition I was lucky enough to have. And it's thanks to her that I have this career. So anyway, AWJ was really important in my
that almost makes me want to cry. You know,
Oh.
I'm so glad that that meant so much to you.
Yes.
And I remember that talk, and it was evidently prophetic. You brought up your mom, and I was reading up again. As I said, I was reading up on you, and somebody said that you've been doing journalism since 1984, and I assert that you've been doing journalism in utero.
Well, I definitely started at age 10. So I did a family newsletter for a decade that started when I was 10 years old, and it was covering the dogs a lot early on. But later on, it was a lot of health crises and gentrification and all sorts of other things. But also at age 10, because my mom was managing editor at the Chicago Defender, I have a kids consumer column. And you can find in the Chicago Defender archives under my name, Tracy Baim, that I started writing at the Chicago Defender. So technically 1973 is my start. But 1984 is when I graduated with a journalism degree from Drake University, and I started at Gay Life newspaper, and then Windy City Times 1985 editions are behind me. That was the year, September 1985 is when Windy City Times, I co-founded it as the managing editor, and then went on to do a bunch of other gay papers before I came to the Reader.
You want to talk more about your mom and what her career was like?
Yeah, so my mom went to Marquette University, and she started working at smaller papers, suburban papers, in I guess it would have been the early 60s. She eventually ended up at the Chicago Tribune, and the Tribune for women in the 60s they were forcing them into the society type coverage. But, you know, she was at the 1968 Democratic riots. She went to Birmingham, Alabama to look at what Martin Luther King was doing in marches. She covered the Marquette protests in Chicago. She was in the thick of 60s civil rights work, and she didn't fit in at the Tribune. They didn't want women doing that, and also even when men were doing it, they were doing it badly because of the choice of the Tribune in terms of how to frame stories. So because of her connections in that world, she actually was very involved in housing discrimination on various governors' commissions, and she worked for Dempsey Travis at the United Mortgage Brokers of America, which was an African-American mortgage brokers organization working against redlining. So I have a lot of her documents from that era where she wrote reports on redlining. She assisted Travis on his book, Autobiography of Black Chicago. She's thanked in the credits. And a lot of her work at the Chicago Defender was tying local issues to international issues. So she would cover things in Honduras or South Africa, making sure that people in Chicago knew about what other civil rights and unrest going around the world. She was managing editor at the Defender for about 10 years, and she still freelanced for them after she left in the mid-80s. She freelanced for me even at gay papers. She went to Cuba many times in her life, mostly illegally. But she went there one time on a church monitoring trip and snuck off and went and covered the AIDS quarantine areas in Cuba for Outlines newspaper, which I had around 1987. So she was always out there trying to figure out freelance for a long, long time after she left the Defender until she died. She was pitching freelance stories. Some of them were just innocent travel stories, and others were trying to cover unrest. Some of the last things she did in her life was she monitored the first free elections in South Africa. I think it was around 94. She went to Cuba again and again, and then she also went to Haiti, I think was her last trip. She went to Tiananmen Square before and after the revolution, the attempt at a revolution there. So she was all over the world. She was always running around doing things. And that last trip to Haiti proved kind of fateful because she was, they were protesting Shell Oil Company because of their horribleness. And they were the only gas station in town, and she had broke her toe. And they were out of gas. They didn't want to go to the Shell station, so they were going to wait overnight there. So she didn't get medical treatment. We're not quite sure if it led to her death a couple months later of much internal bleeding. She also was taking Tylenol, and at the time they didn't know how Tylenol was ruining stomach linings. She was self-medicating because she was on an HMO, and they weren't treating her pain seriously. She had gone to the hospital, and they sent her home and didn't do any tests. She'd been complaining. She was jaundiced. And about 2 weeks later, she started throwing up blood. She went into a coma and died 4 days later. She did come out of the coma once when we were all there. She didn't know how serious it was. And, you know, I blame HMOs. I blame her own hatred of the medical system because of HMOs. And also just the general treatment, the lack of serious treatment of women and their symptoms in healthcare. She was in her early 60s. She lied up and down about her age. We have 2 different birth certificates for her. So we said she was around 63 when she died. But she was a super role model for me in my life in journalism and just life as a woman navigating this world.
And just so, for those who don't know, your mom is Joy Darrow.
Joy Darrow, yes.
Darrow. And just a side note, you're related to Clarence Darrow.
She, through her it's grandniece through her evil stepmother, and she lost her own mother when she was an infant. Her mother died, and so she claimed the name Darrow because the Steinell name, her stepmother's name, or her, I don't even know. I'm a little bit ignorant about the timeline because she lied about her birth, and so I have some things that I have to clarify at some point for her grandchildren. But yes, she celebrated the life of Clarence Darrow starting in the late 1950s. There's been a traditional celebration in March 13th, the anniversary of his death. So that I took on that after she died. She also was very involved with Buckminster Fuller in a lot of his environmental work in the early 70s. She helped with Environmental Inc. was one of his organizations. And so she really gravitated to these big issues that weren't just local, but had profound international impact.
Thanks, Tracy. What I wanted to also thank you for the Joy Darrow Scholarships that the Association for Women Journalists Chicago were able to issue back in the day. And I know that there were a handful of women journalists who really appreciated the support.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great. I'm sorry we couldn't continue it, but it was really great to meet some of those young journalists and tell them a little bit about her mom.
Yeah. Hey, so you're at the Reader. You're the publisher of the Chicago Reader now, and so there's so much work you can do through that and the new nonprofit. But is there anything in particular, like you said, you missed out on doing the academic work, and do you think that sometime you might want to be a teacher, or is there something that's on your list that before you hang it up, that you'd like to possibly get done?
I don't think I want to teach within a traditional framework, but I always am being interviewed by students. And I think part of what I'd like to do out of the Chicago Independent Media Alliance are two really, well, there's many things I want to do with it, but 2 things I would like to come out of it. One is kind of an alternative training center. So people that want to be involved in community media or start their own media, that we have the expertise in Chicago that can help advise them. We can also create some backbone for them for the first 2 or 3 years of helping them create their dream. And not in the traditional way of throwing money at the problem, right? Because we've seen so many failed experiments. You get 2 years of funding and then you're gone because you haven't really learned the chutzpah it takes to do this work. And it isn't for everybody, but you can learn a lot of it. So that's one thing. I think workshops and other ways that we can translate our knowledge from people like City Bureau and Block Club and the Tribe and Cicero Independiente. There's so many people now that have expertise in Chicago that I would like to sell that to universities as a curriculum. And it doesn't have to be more than a weekend. It could be 10 weeks. It could be whatever, right? Like, I think there's some expertise that should be paid for, because I think so many of the journalism schools, almost all of them, are committing malpractice and having people pay for 4-year degrees and coming out unable to enter a system that has any real jobs anymore. So we are more like, itinerant musicians in many ways. So how do you make that work? And so that's one thing. The other thing is I want to convince the foundation world and the corporate world to put more resources into this space. And so this campaign we just did, SaveChicagoMedia.org, was a great pilot. Like, we'll have raised $160,000 for local media with 3 weeks planning. So imagine if we came together as a huge citywide effort, the millions of dollars that we could bring into this ecosystem partnered with foundations and corporate foundations and government, as long as there's a shield between that money and the work. And so that's my big dream, is to convince more foundations, not just the traditional journalism funders, but there are so many funders of Chicago community work that are not funding the journalists that are covering those issues, whether that's environment or criminal justice or whatever. So I want to convince more foundations to see that journalism is incredibly important to amplify the issues that they care about. We've done a little of that already just in a few months with SEMA and with this new campaign. Some funders that did the match have not funded journalism directly much at all. So I'm very hopeful that's possible. So what I really dream of is this Reader Institute becomes a hub of learning and education and resources for anyone that wants to get into that, whether it's a 1-person operation or a 100-person operation, to learn how to do this. We've got some other pilot things we want to try this year, and the Reader is going to be redoing our website. And we're also going to do some journalism pilot projects that we can't really talk about until we pilot them. But we do have some other ideas to not just help the reader, but hopefully journalists in general, and SEMA members as well.
Well, I'll go on record as saying that I'll come in and teach photography if you like.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, I'd love to.
There's different kinds of photography, right? There's event photography, and
Exactly.
protest photography. It's a skill set, right? How do you protect yourself? You know, we just posted a really great photo essay on one of the marches today on the Reader site. I just posted it on my Facebook page, and it's on the Reader page. But that's not the same as other kinds of photography. And there's art to each form of photography. Exactly. So doing just a 5-week course on the different kinds of photography out there and bringing in and paying experts to teach those. So they got a 4-year degree in photography, but now let's put it into practice. Yeah. And get you out there and get you some jobs as a photography intern and blah, blah, blah. So a lot of things we want to do at SEMA is combine resources. So get grants for shared positions. And one of those we've talked about is images and photos. Like, we all can't have a full-time photographer. We all can't have a grant writer. We all can't have an accountant full-time. So how do we share some of the back end and some of the front end editorial gathering? And I'm really hopeful on that front.
Cool. Are you imagining that some of the grants that you could be getting wouldn't be for journalism, so to speak, because so few will fund journalism, but it would be covering a specific issue?
Right, I can definitely see grants that are based on tracks, which already do exist. Like, someone will fund an environmental reporter at a newspaper. So I could see that happening. I could see them funding an environmental reporter that is a shared reporter across all of SEMA members. So they can use that material and also help direct for story ideas. That's a tricky thing, but I do think that it could happen. So beat reporter funding, as well as we all need general operating money. And then there are people like you see at NPR, they get very specific funding for Curious City or other kinds of things they do. So I think there's definitely a lot more money that can come into community media. All of us just don't have the resources to do that fundraising. So we need to figure out a better way to do it. And I think this campaign has blown me away. I mean, we kept it open all weekend because people were still trickling in. I can give you a sense of, because we already passed 1,000 more than last night. So we're basically $3,000 from 100,000 in the individual donors, and then we have 60,000 from the foundation. So it's really blown me away.
That's fantastic, Tracy. To take, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit to take another tact. If you were not able to be a publisher anymore, or not able to do journalism anymore, what do you think you'd like to attempt?
Well, I've written about 12 books and produced a couple movies kind of on the side, and I've certainly done some activist work on the side. I think that I still will always write, and I at some point want to write, not this is an ego thing, I just want to get it down on paper, an autobiography, and I'm going to be 60 in 3 years. So I don't normally have any kind of long-term goals, but I do want to get a book out by the time I'm 60. My worry is that some of the people I want to write about are still alive. So I'm torn about real names on some of it. But I think that I would love to get into the funding side of journalism at some point. And because of my community media experience, that's rare in the foundation world. So many of the foundation people funding journalism come out of the Tribune style journalism, and they know nothing. They come from the editorial side mostly. They know nothing about how to operate the business side of media, and they definitely don't know anything about community media. very, very, very few of the people, and very good people in journalism funding, have the experience that I do or other community media people do. And so I think I could bring value to those large foundations and really getting the nitty-gritty and understanding what's helpful to an operation that's only $50,000 for the year. Like don't give them, you know, all this here when that's actually going to crush them. You need to be realistic with each of them about what's going to actually help them. And sometimes that's just covering the print bill for a while they get their feet back on, you know, whatever. So that would be a great dream, but I'm not holding my breath for that. I hope I can stay in community media. You know, the pace at which I'm at the Reader the last 20 months is pretty damn high. You know, like I haven't had a day off since COVID started. I didn't take any vacation prior to that anyway, but I definitely have not had a day off. And I am aware that I'm 57 years old and I may have been able to work at this pace for 36 years. I'm also aware that I may not be able to forever. About 10 years ago this month, actually, I had a horrible health crisis that took me out of the game for a couple months, forced me out. I was in the hospital 5 weeks, and then I had 18 months of surgeries. And it took about 2 to 3 months to get out of the fog of the medications. So my team ran everything, which was a wonderful exercise that it was forced on me, like that the Windy City Times crew could do the work without me. I want to make myself obsolete at the Reader within a year. I want to have a team of people that can do the work, and I want to have perhaps a co-publisher and a co-publisher of color, and to make sure that the Reader's future is solid and also continues and gets better at representing the community. We inherited a staff that had one person of color. We are now 30% people of color, about 30% queer. We have a lot more younger folks that have joined. So we are a far more diverse staff, but we need and always need to look to do better. And I'm hoping that I can create enough of an infrastructure that we can add to it versus taking away to get to those goals.
I'm glad that you're healthy now. So
yeah, I am too.
Glad you're with us.
Thanks.
I was the first time I knew that I was in a room with you. You were shooting or photographing an event that Paul Simon was at and Pat Schroeder were at, and I don't even remember if I shook your hand or introduced myself, but I remember that there's Tracy Baim. And so that brings up your media, which is you're a photographer and a writer as well. When you're not being entrepreneurial, when you're not being a boss and a gatherer of people and a team builder, those are your mediums. So I was wondering if there's anything left undone in that, in you being a producer. Is there anybody that you want to photograph or interview that you still haven't yet?
Well, for one thing, my photography was always very utilitarian. And if I was the only photographer there, that was the photos you were going to get. You know, like I never felt like I had to perfect that craft.
Yeah. I
was a journalist that could take photos. And in the last few years of my active journalism, I would have a video camcorder, one of those little flip minis, my still camera, and then I would be taking notes when I could. And so I would literally be posting on YouTube for video, photos, and then writing the articles. And I loved it. I loved being a one-person shop, right? Like those musicians that have all their tin cans and everything, right? That felt great. And I do miss the day-to-day journalism at Windy City Times because we were such a small shop. I would write the stories and edit them and take photos, and we had like 5 or 6 people. At the Reader, there's all those other people on editorial, and I'm a publisher, so I'm supposed to stay away from that. And it's actually quite a relief that I'm not in that deadline cycle. I have so much else to do. So my job now is to save the jobs that I love to do, which is journalism and photography. All of my archives, most of them anyway, are now at the Chicago Public Library, Washington Library. There's more than 200 boxes of photos and negatives and press releases, and we've scanned most of those as well. So we give them hard drives with all the millions of digitized images and stuff. So I'm really grateful it's safely in their hands. On my death, they get the rest of it. I think the books have been really fun to do, none of them being bestsellers, but the 12 of them are like my little babies, and they coalesce a set of information into one place, especially the Out and Proud in Chicago book and the book on Chuck Renslow and Barbara Giddings. for Anita Gray. I love doing those books, and I could write one of those every 6 months if I had, if someone just gave me a bunch of money and I didn't have to do anything else. I could just write the stories of my community. And I did a video project called ChicagoGayHistory.org that's still up, and there's over 200 video oral histories on that I still get emails from high school and college students that want to interview some of those folks who are still alive. About 10% of them have passed away since I did it 10 years ago. So there are so many things I feel like I have been compelled to tell the stories of my community since I was 10 years old, whether my sister and brother and parents and dogs, or in 1984, starting with covering the HIV/AIDS crisis, the criticalness of getting down the stories of a wide range of people when the mainstream media ignores them is so important. And a couple of days ago, that was cemented further. I did a talk online with Rebecca Mackay, the author of The Great Believers, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. In the back of that book, she thanks me and the archives of Windy City Times for being a great source of information for the work she was doing. That she couldn't have done the work without the journalism on the front lines in the 80s. She couldn't have done the work as well. And I think 25 years from now, on people covering the COVID crisis and the racial relations of this country, if we don't have the Tribe and Block Club and Windy City Times and the Reader, et cetera, to show a different view than maybe what the New York Times does, then we won't have the truth of history. So I am, till the day I can't do it anymore, I'm compelled to tell those stories in some way. It does not have to be in a physical newspaper or other ways, but I don't think I'll ever stop being wanting to tell stories.
Is there anything more we should talk about that I've missed asking you about?
No, I'm really sad for this moment in history. I am glad that white people are waking up more than they have. I can't believe sometimes what it takes to wake up white people. The ignorance in this country it's unconscionable how ignorant even many of my own friends continue to be. Covering this week on my Facebook page, a lesbian bar on the north side, Spiners. The owner said some really racist stuff that the way she posted it was like very prideful, like, hey, I wanted to share what I just said with my friend Perkins, and then just posted about, just horrible racist shit. And then of course there was backlash and she apologized, but you just thought that was okay to put that out there in the middle of a racial upheaval. No. And it's constant. And there were white friends of mine defending her and other friends defending her. But there were so many that showed up to protest her. And I don't know that would have happened 5 or 10 years ago. I don't know what it would have risen to the level that it got covered. So I have hope all the time. I have optimism, but I am just so sad. And I can't believe what this country has done to people of color in general, but African Americans and Native Americans in particular, and now immigrants. We are just the most xenophobic, horrible place. And the fact that there haven't been more uprisings is on the grace of communities, not because of anything we've done. What we have done as white people, as conquerors, as colonizers, as capitalists, treating people as products and slaves, and in modern day, treating them as basically assets on an asset line, on an accounting sheet for their employees, is unconscionable and horrible. And I am grateful for the people putting themselves on the line right now, fighting against that and fighting against police brutality. I am in favor of a form of abolition. We need to focus our criminal justice system just on violent offenders. Everything else can be dealt with through some other kind of restorative justice or reconciliation ways, including white collar criminals paying back and doing other things. Their labor needs to be not in prison, but in the forwarding of change and paying back. So I am very supportive of what's going on. And if it takes this to make change, we can't judge it as white people. So I'm grateful for the reporters on the front line, the photographers on the front line, but especially the activists.
And thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Care to give any shout outs to anybody in particular?
No, I'm really grateful for my team, especially the editors at Windy City Times, the whole team there, Terry Klinsky, Andrew Davis, Matt Simonette, Kirk Williamson, and my partner, Jean Albright, who does the website. And then at the Reader, the whole 2018 crew, including the editors, Karen and Sujay, they just do phenomenal work every day to make my job easier to do the work I need to do.
Thank you, Tracy Baim.
Thanks for having me.